Chapter 7. Ghouls Just Want to Have Fun. Simon Belmont snapped his whip. Crack! The end of the whip hit the ghoul right in the misty stuff that composed its chest. The thing was hurled back a footstep, but then it righted itself and just kept on coming. Simon pulled the whip back, readying it to crack again. Tim Bradley stood in his tracks, frightened out of his mind. This wasn't just any two-dimensional program TV image dot array that could be handled with a joystick. It was a living, breathing, so rotten it smelled worse than Tim Sock's monster. No, scratch that. It was a dead, living, breathing monster. This thing was about 7 feet tall. Its gray skin hung down in tatters, revealing bones and worms beneath. Its popping orbs looked like the eyes of a long-dead fish, but when you looked closer at the grim thing, it got worse. When you looked closer, you saw the thing was only half solid. It seemed to be composed half of flesh and half of gray smog lit from within by an unearthly glow. Simon's whip unfurled, catching the thing again, this time squarely in its skull face. Crack! This time the whip had an instant effect. An explosion like an M80 going off in a garbage can sounded out. Shivers of energy-infested ectoplasm radiated around the whip's end. The whole creature shook. Then, with a bright shimmer, it seemed to wrench away from existence, as though some kind of hook had come out of nowhere and dragged it into a black hole, leaving only its outline behind. The outline turned to a dazzle that glittered over Simon Belmont like fairy dust. Simon shivered, and his eyes got wide for a moment. Then he recoiled his whip around in his hand and nodded towards Tim. Ah, yes, energy. Already I feel recharged with vigor. I am ready for another. Well, good for you, Simon. Me, I'm ready to go back to that safe, warm tavern. Tim wasn't serious. He knew that he had a job ahead of him, and he had promised to do, and he wasn't the sort to weasel out of his commitments. But all in all, he would rather be back in the tavern, sipping hot chocolate, than fighting ghouls in the middle of a dark Castlevanian night. They'd finished their dinner back at the Heart and Soul. The innkeeper had wanted them to eat more, but Simon had insisted that too much to eat and drink would make them tired and heavy for tonight's action. Just a little catnap would do, he insisted. And that was what they'd had, too, a catnap, right there on one of those benches of the tavern, right beside two tavern cats. Fortunately, Tim's allergies weren't acting up, so he actually managed to go to sleep despite all the excitement of the day, and all the excitement yet to come, and all the caffeine and all the chocolate bars he'd devoured. It must have been all that warm milk he'd drunk. When he woken up, it was dark outside, so he figured it was time to go. However, the sun was still up, even though it was low in the sky. They'd spent the remaining minutes warming up their muscles with exercises. Then Simon had prepared himself by sitting very still with his legs folded under him. Tim had prepared himself by eating a bag of M&Ms. Simon's voice brought him back to the present. There's no time for loafing in warm taverns, Timothy Bradley. Look, here come 2 more ghouls. You take one, and I'll deal with the other. Sure enough, coming out of a narrow alley like 2 gravestones with arms, legs, and bad attitudes shambled 2 ghouls. They hissed harshly, opening mouths filled with sharp teeth. Long claws reached out to rend and tear at their victims. All in all, it was not a pleasant sight. Tim Bradley lifted the sword that Simon had given him just after they'd arrived at the inn. He would have preferred a gun. However, Simon Belmont had informed him not only of the fact that there were no guns in Castlevania, but that even if they were imported from another dimension, they wouldn't work here. Gunpowder didn't explode in Castlevania. Things work on magical principles here, Timothy, Simon had explained, and also on the moral laws of good and evil. That is why I am very good and Dracula is very bad. Anyway, now Tim Bradley didn't have any time to worry about niceties of ethics and moral philosophy. He had a snarling creature to deal with. The ghoul bore down on him with surprising speed for something that looked like it was going to fall apart at any moment. Tim swung the sword over his head towards the creature, but somehow missed. The metal sword crashed down on the cobbles noisily. Crack! Sang the song of Simon's whip from behind him as the hero dealt with his ghoul. The ghoul's razor-sharp fingernails reached out and ripped at Tim's jacket. The whole arm was torn. Yow! Said Tim. My mom's gonna kill me. The ghoul had just The ghoul just snarled and pushed its outstretched hands toward Tim Bradley's throat. "You rat! I hope you have a mom, 'cause that's who I'm sending you back to." With all his might, Tim lifted the sword and swung it towards the spot where Simon's wick had been so effective on the last ghoul. The thick pitted blade sliced into the mist skin, and immediately sparks flew out like a blowout in the spiral sky. As he watched with astonishment, the ghoul slowly faded away. Before it was completely invisible, it was yanked from its existence on this plane, leaving behind only its outline. The outline hovered, shimmering for an instant, and then, with like a tiny piece cut from a whirlwind of light, it flew up the metal of Tim's sword. He felt as though he'd stuck both hands into an electrical outlet. Energy coursed through him, and without a buzz, it felt like his hair was standing on end. He also felt as though he'd been jolted awake. Goodness, he said, blinking as he turned to Simon. "That really packs a wallop." He felt as though he'd just run a mile and then drunk a quart of Gatorade. Refreshed, vital, alert. "I feel like somebody's just changed my batteries." "Yes, you see, now we have sufficient energy to deal with the next part of our mission." "What is it, pray tell?" asked Tim, fairly bouncing off the walls of his feet. "According to Linda Entwistle, we must locate the rib of Dracula." "That must be his funny bone. He sure seems to have lost it." Gosh, he felt alive and buoyant. It was like he could conquer the world and then play 2 hours of touch football in the evening. "Yes, perhaps. She said that we would receive a clue as to its whereabouts from the central signpost in the middle of Castlevania." Simon's face twitched. "First, though, I seem to be hungry again. Perhaps we should go back to the Heart and Soul Tavern. There we can eat a decent meal. Eggs and flapjacks, I should think." "Oh, yes, and cake with whipped cream. And apples? Lots of apples. And you can eat your chocolate, and we can wash it all down with yards of foamy ginger ale. And then we can eat sausages and jams, and then perhaps we can think about dessert." This sounded good to Tim. He was always hungry. He could do with a couple Cadbury bars, if only to celebrate his victory over the ghoul, but then he caught himself up short. This was the sort of warning sign that Simon had told him about. Wasn't gluttony one of the 7 deadlies? His stomach rumbled. Still, some pancakes would be awfully delicious. No, he told himself. That was why he was here, to help Simon resist temptations, not to fall to them himself. He had a responsibility to fulfill, and he meant to do just that. He kicked Simon Belmont in the butt. Not real hard, but firmly enough to wrest his attention away from treats and sweets. "Ouch!" said Simon as he lifted his whip up, turning with a look of anger and menace on Tim. "Why did you strike me, mortal?" "You see, you're even starting to sound like Dracula." Simon's mouth dropped open. "Yes, you're right. And so you kicked me upon my nether parts." Simon patted Tim upon his shoulder. "Excellent. Already Linda has guided me truly in selecting such a fine fellow as you." Tim felt a stirring feeling. He really liked this guy. When Simon Belmont had a good thought about someone, he shared it. He was thoughtful, sincere, and honest. So what if he was a bit unhip? He had his own brand of cool. "Any time, Simon." Tim looked down at the intersecting streets, deserted now, all wrapped in night and eerie mist. "Well, we'd better get going to that signpost now, right? The question is, which way?" "Right, my true friend. The way to the signpost is no problem. Follow me." And Tim, trusting Simon to show him the correct way, followed.